Welcome to our live stream about Thomas Jefferson in England with first-person interpreter Bill Barker. My name is Elizabeth Lucas. Please add your questions in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.
Oh, well, I thank you, Ms. Lucas, for introducing me. I beg your pardon, citizens. I was too much in the pages of this book, but I was trying to be mindful of the time that we would gather together here at our Monticello, gathering together again upon the subject of my travels. And I cannot think of two particular acquisitions that I have with me from my travels than a book and a timepiece as representative of what I so enjoyed to search out during my time. Today's subject will be my time in England and London. And so if you would allow me to be seated, thank you. Then we can proceed with the questions and curiosities. So if you will, Ms. Lucas, what is the first question from our visitors?
So, Mr. Jefferson, we know that you were commissioned by our new government to succeed Dr. Franklin as our second minister plenipotentiary to France. What prompted you to visit England while you were overseas, and was it your first time there?
Very good question indeed. Well, firstly, I can tell you this. I was prompted to visit London by our first minister plenipotentiary to England, our friend John Adams. Now, you are correct, Ms. Lucas. I had visited England before, but my first trip to London was in between my first visit to England and the last visit to England. The first and last both occurring as I was sailing to France and returning from France. So as I sailed from Boston Harbor, it was the 5th of July in 1784, to represent our nation at the court of King Louis of France. I then arrived in, well, let me see, it was near Portsmouth towards the end of July. And I spent several days there. I remember my dear daughter, Mrs. Randolph, she was quite ill at the time, and Dr. Meeks was wont to prescribe some remedies for her. I also sought out the occasion there, my first trip to England, to visit with an old family friend, Elizabeth Titchfield. Elizabeth Titchfield, of course, was Elizabeth Blair. I knew her when she was a small girl, as I knew her father, Dr. John Blair, residents in Williamsburg, Virginia. I'll never forget, I arrived at the house. They hardly knew that I would be arriving, and as I made a rap on the door, the servant approached and said, "I beg your pardon, sir, but Mrs. Titchfield is not here." Well, lamentably, I took leave, and I found out much later, when I wrote her, lamenting that we did not meet up, that she was there. She was above stairs. It was when, upon such an occasion, I became acquainted that unlike the unwritten code of hospitality in Virginia, where you welcome anyone at any time, and anyone told that the other individual is not at home is immediately known to be false. We're always at home, always ready to greet. But in England, I discovered this is not so much the case. I remember when last I visited England, it was because of the equinoxial storms that were billowing up there during the autumn. That was 1789. And so the ship could hardly leave Le Havre. We were held there for a time in order to make it across the channel and then again to Dover. So we were held up in England, there in and about Dover for several days. I think it was more than a week. And I remember one of the last individuals I had the pleasure to associate before I stepped from the shore of England, well, perhaps for the rest of my life, was John Trumbull. John Trumbull and I had tea there, and I also visited Dover Castle. So those were the first trips and the last trips that I made to England, but my first trip to London was by the request of John Adams. And the reason for it simply, he let me know that this would be an occasion, this particular time in the spring of 1786, when we could meet with a number of ambassadors of European kingdoms in order to negotiate treaties of commerce and treaties of trade, particularly with Portugal, let alone treaties of peace. So he was suggesting that I would come to London for this opportunity and that the two of us together could better represent the concerns and the interests of our nation.
So in the spring of 1786, did you travel directly to London, and where did you stay there?
Yes, in essence, I did. When I landed in England, then I went straight to London, and I stayed on Golden Square. That's where I stayed. I believe it was number 14 Golden Square that I had apartments. And then, of course, I went directly to meet with Mr. Adams. And he was staying, I believe it was at Grosvenor Square that I went to meet with him. His house in Grosvenor Square. Oh, I met with Mr. Adams nearly every single day that I was in London. And then, of course, well, no, I'm not going to say the two of us, the three of us, meaning essentially Mr. and Mrs. Adams and myself, took a delightful vacation, if you want to call it, a trip, travels through the Midlands of England. And that was about for a 2-week period.
So what was the purpose of your journey with John and Abigail Adams through the Midlands of England?
Well, first and foremost, the journey was to occupy our time because it appeared that the British ministers were doing everything they possibly could to prevent these two Americans from collaborating and engaging with foreign dignitaries and foreign ambassadors in order to accomplish treaties of trade and commerce and peace. So it was with that in mind, we decided to make use of our time. Again, the most important commodity man can possess, not the timepiece, but time itself, to make use of our time to visit many of the manor houses and the fine gardens all throughout England, to visit Blenheim and Stowe and Hagley House, to visit the Lissos, if you will, in Chiswick. All of these fine manor houses and their gardens, which particularly intrigued me. I have always been one devoted to gardening. I think you all know that, the cultivation of the soil. I consider one of the most noble vocations of man. So with my Thomas Whately in hand, and there you have the element of a book, Thomas Whately, and his treatise on gardening, landscape design, as they call it, the embellishment of nature, the erection of follies in gardens, and how to engage waterways and falls and lakes and ponds and all. This was an interest that I sought to pursue in the company of Mr. and Mrs. Adams.
So you mentioned gardens and plants. One of our viewers, Bridget, wonders if you brought back seeds, plants, or flowers from England.
Well, I will tell you that I became very, very much interested in the rose while I was in England. I think it is one of the most beautiful flowers in nature. And do you know, it happens to be considered the same by Mr. and Mrs. Adams. They appreciate the rose. But I cannot think of another nation which cultivates roses to such a beautiful extent and of so many hybrids than England. They are masterful at the cultivation of the rose. So yes, Mr. and Mrs. Adams and myself procured roses and brought them back with us, particularly the Rosa alba. This is simply the white rose. Next to the Rosa gallica, the red rose, they are two of the oldest roses on the globe and throughout human history. They've been referred to from time immemorial. And Bridget, you may know that Rosa gallica and the Rosa alba, of course, were used as the symbols during the great contests and conflicts, wars and battles between the houses of Lancaster and York. The white rose signifying the house of York, the red rose, the house of Lancaster. So I will tell you, you may well understand where the sentiments of Mr. and Mrs. Adams and I rest upon that conflict. And with which house? Because the two of us procuring the white rose brought it back with us to plant at our homes. Mr. and Mrs. Adams, when they later moved into Peacefield in Quincy, and myself to plant the white rose here at El Monticello. Coincidentally, Bridget, you may be interested to know, and have been told by many people accordingly, that the white rose planted by Mrs. Adams is still blooming at Peacefield. I wish I could say the same about my white rose.
So, Mr. Jefferson, what sights on the trip most impressed you? Did the Adamses share your opinions during the trip?
It's a very good question. Many impressive sights. I would say, however, that the one sight that still remains in my mind, having been all my life a great aficionado of the writings of the English bard William Shakespeare, was our visit to Stratford-upon-Avon. To have the opportunity not only to see the house in which he was born, but also to see his tomb, to see inscribed there, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the bones enclosed here. Cursed be he that moves these bones, or may he be spared that does not," whatever, I can't recall precisely. But that remains in my mind. Particularly, I will tell you, because while there, we were told a certain chair belonged to the great bard, Mr. Shakespeare. Well, Mr. Adams and I could certainly not let that pass without noticing that some of the woodwork and splinters were quite obvious, perhaps, to be procured very quickly and taken with us. So, yes, I'm not going to deny that we can be relic hunters ourselves at heart. I still have a piece of Mr. Shakespeare's chair.
So, Mr. Jefferson, you spent most of your time abroad in Paris. And Doug, one of our viewers, asks if you prefer London or Paris.
Well, Doug, I will tell you this. I have often wondered about the architecture in London. Remember, I was not able to go up to London when we first landed in England back in the summer of 1784. So I was very curious, having enjoyed the modern architecture of the city of Paris as I was to bear witness once I arrived. That is the fact that many of the old medieval and dark buildings were being dismantled and demolished and torn down in Paris as they were building a new city of light, a city of the limestone that they dug from underneath the ground in Paris. Light and bright and beautiful and with a sense of, well, may I call it classical proportion. So what would London be like? Well, I will tell you, Doug, I was rather startled that the buildings in London did appear to be better, to be more handsome, if I may say so, than the buildings in Paris, but not so handsome as I know the buildings to be in Philadelphia. Yes, the buildings in Philadelphia I've found to be clean, to be very much designed in a sense of proportion, and what they call the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost houses of 3 particular stories with an efficiency of living space and intimacy so preserved. So I did not find this in London, though, as you well know, William Penn was well acquainted with London, his family in particular. And I would say in general, overall, that it's somewhat of a miserable architecture all throughout England and London, although it is far more miserable here in Virginia, I can assure you that.
Now, Mr. Jefferson, you have some family connections to England, and Madeline wonders if you visited any relatives while in England.
Well, Madeline, I will tell you that once I arrived in London, I did make an effort to visit Shadwell Parish. Shadwell is one of the villages east of London where my mother, Jane Randolph, was born. And so I had the opportunity to walk along Shakespeare's Alley or Shakespeare's Row, I think it is called, a little alleyway through Shadwell, and to see the birthplace of my mother. I even visited, if you will, the churchyard of St. Paul's, where the Randolph family, my mother's family, had been buried for several generations. So yes, I visited there. I did not visit Wales, and I say that specifically because, as I have written, and it is a family account, the Joffre's sons, that is the Jeffersons, were originally from Wales, considered to be seated at the foot of Mount Snowdon. Now, that is not where the progenitor of our family came from when he originally sailed to America. No, from all accounts that I can discover, there were a number of Jeffersons in the early settlement at Jamestown, early in Virginia's history. There was a John Jefferson, I believe, who sailed from London in a ship known as the Bonanova, and I believe he stepped foot on Jamestown Island in 1612. A secretary of the Virginia House of Burgesses in those early years at Jamestown was also named Jefferson. So they must have been in England, perhaps in London directly, for several generations before my immigrant arrived here. So I wish I could tell you more about the Jefferson ancestry, but I can tell you distinctly, as I've written, the Randolph family has a pedigree going all the way back through England, ultimately to Scotland, and related to Robert the Bruce, to which, Douglas, anyone is free to ascribe merit if they so choose.
Great. So did you discover anything in your travels through England which might be beneficial to our nation? And Deborah is also curious to know what you discovered about the different foodways, accents, and culture in the various regions of England. Were you challenged or amused or perplexed by them?
Oh, Deborah, we have quite a few questions all in one there. One thing that I came to see in England, and I referred to it early on with my referral, of course, to try and visit Mrs. Titchfield there near Portsmouth, is the fact that the British in general appear to be, well, quite preoccupied with manner and quite preoccupied with particular distancing in their reception toward you. Again, I can only refer to my experience having been born and grown up in the wilderness of Virginia, where family relationships and the consanguinity from the Latin word sanguine, meaning the flow of blood, flows through all of so many different heritages, so many different races. And so you can only imagine, whereas the French have their particular manner, very ingratiating, I can certainly say, the British have their particular manner that I observed. Now, as far as their language, their vernacular, if you will, their various accents, well, yes, but no different than the accents that we have here in America, particularly between the northern states and the southern states. And when you consider, well, predominantly, as we are all colonies of Great Britain, that we were essentially British, Englishmen, well, we were not. We were governed by Great Britain. There were a number of Englishmen, quite a predominant number of Englishmen, but there are all so many other different peoples, those from the kingdoms of the Italies, those predominantly from the kingdoms of the Germanys. In fact, when I was sailing down the Rhine, I remarked to Mr. Madison in a letter, from everything that I now see, which I have already seen in our native land, I've come to the conclusion that next to the English, the Germans make up the greater portion of our population. But I want to be errant here in this reflection. Vernacular and accents, I think, are prone simply to the terrain, the climate of various areas separated by great distances, and particularly mountain ranges. So I would not say that I noticed or saw any more degree in the difference of languages through England than I know in our own land. And yet it is all predominantly the English language and derivatives thereof. Now, I'm thinking as I've rambled on here to the experiences of vernaculars accents throughout England. I missed the first part of the question. Might you repeat it, Miss Lucas?
Yes. Did you discover anything in your travels through England which might be beneficial to our new nation?
Yes, and I think I've already referred to it initially. This and this. Books. Next to my constant attention at the bookstores in Paris, I attended to bookshops all throughout London, London in particular, a city of many, many shops. In fact, that is what the Emperor Napoleon called England entirely, a nation of shops. But happily, many, many bookshops. Stockdale's was one of them, and I procured many fine books that I've been looking for many, many years. And then to be able to attend to the repository of many books from many generations. By that I mean my visit to Oxford, having the opportunity to visit the Bodleian Library, to be able to have a conversation with the Reverend John Price, who even at that time had been the librarian at the Bodleian for, I venture to say, upwards of about 40 years, if not longer. So books were always my great pleasure. Oh, I remember at the Bodleian, I had a chance to read some of John Locke's own books, books that he owned. As you know, he was a professor there. Then the other is a timepiece, timepieces. If the English excel in anything, it is certainly the mechanical arts. And so I had the opportunity in London not only to attend to Ramsay's shop, Dollard's shop for the procurement of mathematical instruments, globes, if you will, meteorological instruments, astronomical instruments, I mentioned, surveying instruments, measuring instruments. I also had the opportunity to visit many a watchmaker. Now, I will tell you, before I left France, I made it an effort to visit with the Astronomer Royal. I attended the same thing in England. Before I left England, I visited the Astronomical Observatory at Greenwich. What was the gentleman's name? Neville Masterline. Neville Masterline. I have not thought about him for years. My interest, of course, was to become the better acquainted with setting a standard of time, by which, of course, then all of the navigation of the globe for the Englishman, let alone all of our setting of time by minutes and seconds across the globe in longitude and latitude, were to originally take root there at Greenwich. So these are two places I shall never, ever forget. That is the bookshops throughout, the mathematical equipment stores, the gardens that I visited. Oh, Thomas Whatley would be so happy to know that when I visited these gardens, that the gardens were almost precisely as he explained them and delineated them in his work. That was what I was setting out to observe. That is what I thought Mr. and Mrs. Adams would be interested in accordingly, and they were. In fact, I will tell you this. Here I ramble on about all of these travels, what I was fascinated with and attended to, my observations on gardenings and the like. Do you know that Mr. Adams kept a diary? He kept a distinct diary, far more detailed than anything I might be explaining to you today. So I would hope that perhaps someday, if what I have written is deficient in its detail, that Mr. Adams' diary will allow posterity to know more distinctly his precise opinion and observations, which were a bit more acute and perhaps a bit more caustic than whatever I have already said or written.
So, Mr. Jefferson, you met a lot of people in England and London. Did you meet King George III and Queen Charlotte, and what were they like?
I only hesitate to be a bit cautious upon this subject. I shall say generally this. I was ungraciously received. Now, you can well understand this. Appearing before their majesties, King George and Queen Charlotte, was the author of the Declaration of our American independence. Now, before me, of course, Mr. Adams had appeared before the king. He was our nation's minister plenipotentiary to the court of St. James's By that, plenty meaning all, potentially meaning powers. He held all the powers of our government, executive, judicial, legislative, there at the court of the British monarch with whom we had conflicted in our war. That was at the formal court, if you will, at St. James's Palace. Now, the royal family did not live at St. James's Palace, but that is where all the formalities were attended to. The royal family lived at Buckingham House, or as it was frequently referred to, the Queen's House. I believe they refer to it now as Buckingham Palace. It is a beautifully, overlarge building. Mr. Adams might have this in his diary, and perhaps his son, grandson, may someday relate that when Mr. Adams introduced me as his co-ambassador, though the king certainly knew that I was our nation's minister plenipotentiary at the court of King Louis of France, that the king turned his back on me. Perhaps this is what the future will learn, but I have not been so distinct to relate. Again, it can be well understood. I will never forget when many a member of Parliament, particularly William Pitt the Younger, Mr. Edward Burke, of course, and John Wilkes, that these gentlemen were lending more of an ear and an empathy to the concerns of the colonies of North America than the king would allow to be known. King George III was indeed very concerned about losing the American colonies. Even as the war progressed and there were efforts by the aforementioned Englishmen and others to bring the war to a close, to ameliorate, to reconcile, it is said that the king desired it to continue all the way through as best as possible to be won on behalf of the British. So this is why I cannot certainly ignore the fact that I would have been received as the minister plenipotentiary of our nation to France with such a sense of disdain.
So, Mr. Jefferson, you mentioned John Adams and your time with him, and we have a 10-year-old viewer, Ezra, who would like to know if you had any disagreements with John Adams.
Oh, Ezra. I doubt we could call ourselves Americans if we did not have disagreements amongst ourselves. And yet at the same time to realize as Americans, where could man be more free upon this globe to agree to disagree? And yet as well, and most important, to remember as Americans, a difference of opinion must never be a difference of principle. By that, Ezra, I mean we can hold our differences of opinion as the 13 individual colonies were wont to do. Remember that? Before the war, all of those 13 colonies were arguing, bickering amongst themselves. But then we began to realize that we can reconcile our differences. We can make things better if we come together. That's the principle we showed ourselves and the rest of the world. 2 heads are better than 1, 3 heads better than 2, 13 heads collectively. E pluribus unum provides a better opportunity to reconcile differences and reconcile arguments. Ultimately, everyone will benefit. So yes, Ezra, I will not deny, Mr. Adamson and I had disagreements, particularly when we stood opposed to one and the other in the election of 1800. Well, it wasn't even the election of 1800 before it was the election of 1796. Remember that, Ezra? President George Washington said he would not be president for a 3rd term. And Ezra, I can tell you, I was eyewitness. He could have been president for life. But he realized a founding principle of our nation: rotation in office. That provides more clearly a representation of who we are as a people from one generation to the next. So when President Washington stepped down as president, he would not accept a 3rd term. Well, then oh, by the way, as we're talking about England, I have to throw something into this commentary. Do you know it is said that when King George III of England learned that President Washington would not accept a 3rd term, that he had stepped down as president, it is said King George III remarked, if this is true, George Washington is the greatest man who ever lived. So I will tell you, at that time in 1796, here was Vice President Adams and myself, the former Secretary of State, opposing one and the other for the presidency. Well, naturally, we had differences of opinion, and well, as you may know, I was not the victor. John Adams was elected our second president. And as the Constitution originally says, whoever receives the second highest number of votes then becomes vice president. That's how it was originally written. It has not remained that way. Thank heaven we have amendments and that we can disregard and throw out and expunge that which is not useful to the greater efficiency of government by and for the people. Our 12th Amendment rectified that. But I had to become vice president as the Constitution was originally written. 4 years, and I had opposed Adams. Now, how can two gentlemen in opposition to one another reconcile so easily? Well, it was near impossible, and I was not a silent vice president. So in 1800, there we were with more differences of opinion, and I was invited to oppose him again. So you can imagine those differences of opinion. And of course, that time in 1800, I was the victor ultimately. Well, Mr. Adams was not the choice for vice president because it was Colonel Aaron Burr who received the second highest number of votes. He was standing for president too at that time. So I beg your pardon, Ezra, I've certainly rambled on, but I will tell you this, despite differences of opinion that Mr. and Mrs. Adams and I had between us, oh my heavens, I consider him, always have considered him a friend. He remains deep in my affections, and I will never forget our trip through the Midlands of England, visiting Stratford-upon-Avon, visiting Blenheim, visiting, if you will, Chiswick House, visiting Hegley House, as I mentioned, or Stowe. Oh, Stowe was magnificent. Oh, the Adams were certainly taken with Stowe. So was I. All of the beautiful landscaping with follies. Temples in the distances, if you will, and Arc de Triomphes over bridges across ponds. Oh, I'm getting carried away, but I can tell you that Mr. Adams and I and Mrs. Adams were all together in our appreciation of this beautiful embellishment of nature.
Right. So speaking of differences and back to England, what do you think of the conditions of free laborers in England and how to compare to slavery in the United States? Is there something to be learned from that comparison?
I don't know how one can compare the two as being alike. They are certainly not alike. They are at complete opposite ends of the spectrum of human labor and how it may be applied, if you will, to the productivity of a nation and a people. Let us not forget that here in our own land, when we were still colonies, that though there were laws of slavery on the books, even in New England, that New England had a better opportunity to engage a wage-earning economy, that is, to pay a wage for any degree of labor. Well, this, of course, had been known in Great Britain. It had been applied in Great Britain. It was truly at the foundation of the subject, The Wealth of Nations, which was written and published by the Englishman Adam Smith. How we might better engage commerce, how we might better engage the division of labor, how we might provide better incentives for labor and the payment thereupon. And so the English, the British were very much at the forefront of this. And remember this too, when you pay a wage for the labor that is engaged and conducted, what do you do with the monies you're given for your labors? You spend it. Particularly in the company store, you give it back, and that accumulates and creates more money, hard money. And you know that enslaved labor does not accomplish any of this. It is a blight not only upon the dignity of the individual who is enslaved, it is a blight upon the public finance. It is a detriment to the improvement of merchandising and productivity. You're supporting a system of labor. How long can that possibly last? And particularly as we began to realize here in the old colony of Virginia, Before the American Revolution began, the population of the enslaved was growing to nearly 50% of the population of our colony. Imagine if that continued on, that more than 50% of the population was supported. It cannot last. That was one of our great problems from the very beginning, one of the great conundrums we still face, one of which I am certainly not proud. And so I can tell you, we had much to learn from the British efficiency of their commerce, their manufacture in particular, and their division of labor. I think that the work of our Adam Smith, his Wealth of Nations, is brilliant. We have much to learn from that, how we can help a people, all people, ultimately prosper. And by that I mean certainly those who are at present enslaved. Let us continue to work towards that.
Thank you. So, Mr. Jefferson, would you recommend to Americans they should visit England, and what places in particular?
I do recommend that Americans visit Great Britain, visit London in particular, find there what I have found some of the finest bookstores, find some of the finest shops devoted to the mechanical arts, to be able to visit some of these fine manors and see the beauty, if you will, not only of some of those manor houses, but the gardens. If there is anything in which the English excel, it is in gardens, extraordinary gardens. And I say that after having been eyewitness to some of the most beautiful gardens throughout the Kingdom of France, the kingdoms of the Italies, and of the Germany sailing down the Rhine. But a good many of those gardens of those ancient European kingdoms are somewhat, if I may use the term, straight-laced. They're rather delineated in straight lines and rather tight. What makes the difference in an English garden? It's appeal to nature. It's recognition, if you will, of the natural delineation of lines in nature. That the British serve to embellish nature, as has been seen in the accomplishments of such landscape designers as Capability Brown. Sir Lancelot Brown is his official name. He was the son of a gardener upon a British manor in England. And Sir Lancelot Brown grew up to understand better that many would be interested to know how they might improve upon nature, that what nature has provided us is certainly beautiful indeed. But what can man do to praise nature and our Creator more in his works? And so that is why he became known as providing a great capability of what man can do to embellish nature. So as we travel throughout all of these Midlands of England and visit the many manor houses, Americans will be able to see not only the fine work of Capability Brown, but others as well, that we can adopt for our better appreciation of nature and the cultivation of the soil in the art of fine gardening. Oh, and I also suggest, please visit Oxford. I would hope you would indeed. I never had the opportunity to go to Cambridge, but visit Oxford and visit with the Englishmen and learn more about the disputes that we had during our American Revolution. Learn more about how the foundation of American jurisprudence, even the foundation of our own Constitution, is essentially British. Its foundation may be found in British common law, the great Magna Carta. I had the opportunity to actually see the Great Charter of 12 and 15. So to visit England reminds us of the great legacies that we have received from Great Britain, the beauty, the purity of English law, which I have always said grows with the experience from one generation to the next of the English-speaking peoples. This is something we can continue to reflect upon in a most benevolent and respectful and thankful way for our relationship with the British.
So, Mr. Jefferson, you mentioned the beauty of the English gardens, and as a follow-up, Chester, one of our viewers, asks what ideas were learned from the English gardens that were applied at Monticello.
Well, Chester, I will tell you, come and visit if you have not already been here, or come back and further appreciate that I have made the effort to design my gardens here in the British fashion. I think the most obvious is the West Lawn. The West Lawn with the flowers planted in their different beds, oval beds, not strict rectangular or square beds, oval beds, if you will, and somewhat of a serpentine walkway, serpentine, like a serpent, wiggling around here with curves, if you will, around the entire West Lawn. And then the plantings about, all of the trees, the formal trees as well. No rigidity in trees planted in straight lines, if you will, or within squares or cubes, no, but planted naturally on the outskirts of the garden and down the hillsides and the like. And then remember too, Chester, the entire ascent of the mountain as you come up, El Monticello, is through the wilds of woodlands and nature. Many have commented upon it, how somewhat fantastic it looks, almost with a kind of frightening aspect to it. Well, why? This is the beauty of nature. This ought to be the comfort that nature provides us. So that's why I've left so much just as it was, as I have known it from my youth, as you are ascending and coming up the mountaintop, and in so many ways in the roundabouts that I have designed here. So that would be something I would think is most obvious here at El Monticello, that I observed in England and enforced and influenced me so much that I brought it back here at my own home.
Thank you. And we have time for one final question. One of our viewers, S. Gustafson, asks, what was the hardest and best part of your journey?
The hardest and best part of my journey through England or around the globe. I think the hardest is the fact that I may not have the opportunity to return. That's hard. I would love to. The best are all of the fine memories that remain with me, that continue to be most influential, that I can continue to employ and enjoy in conversation with you, Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. Gustafson. To enjoy all of this is the art of conversation. I miss that. That was one of the hardest things to leave in conversation with so many Englishmen. In conversation, if you will, with Judge Richard Peters. I bring him up because Judge Peters, a Pennsylvanian, was in England at the same time I was there. And I remember conversations that I had in his company along with William Stevens Smith. I make mention of him too, because it was Colonel Smith who came over to Paris inviting me to follow through with the invitation of Mr. John Adams to go with him to London, to England, follow with him, and thereby to engage in the business I mentioned earlier of negotiations and treaties and trade and treaties of peace as well. So Judge Peters, Mr. Colonel Smith, and myself enjoyed the most delightful conversations, the most delightful outings. Good heavens, I'll never forget when we went to Dolly's Steakhouse. Oh my heavens, Dolly's Steakhouse. Would that I could go back there. That was hard to leave. Do you know, we were so occupied in our conversations and our delights at Dolly's Steakhouse that we forgot all about an outing that we were to go into with Mrs. Adams. She was preparing and we hardly were there, so preoccupied at Dolly's. I even wrote a poem about it. I should have to search it out to recite it to you properly, word for word. And then to think as well, it was hard to leave that occasion where I enjoyed listening and actually speaking with a learned pig. I am not bluffing here. No, a learned pig. There was a pig who appeared to have learned how to write Latin and Greek, even speak it, even, if you will, to provide mathematical equations and the like. Oh, you paid money to have to see him. Yes, rest assured, that is the purpose. But to think that you would have such an opportunity, where else but in London, And it's so true. It had been trained. It was trained to actually recite or to make motion of calculations and the like. Is not this the experience of so many of us when we travel afar and see so many things we've never seen before that astound us? Is it not hard to think you may not go back? Is it not hard to break away? Is this not why travel is so much a pursuit of happiness, and travel so much a part of education and enlightenment? So I provide for you, Mr., Mrs. Gustafson, the advice that I have given so many of my fellow Americans: travel. Travel extensively, and perhaps not too long, because with all that you will see and all that you will engage and enjoy, you will have to return and be somewhat shocked to see we may not have this in our nation. But is it not a reason why we should not pursue these arts, pursue this enlightenment in our own country to improve the taste of our own countrymen?
Questions, Mr. Jefferson?
Well, I could not be more delighted to have spent this time with you all, and look forward to the next time that we might gather here. I hope that perhaps many of you will engage a book to your particular interest and fancy. We'll speak about it perhaps later, and pursue further travels. We initiated in our last gathering before this commentary upon my extensive travels about the globe. So we've touched on London. Maybe some future subjects may be Paris, or the Germanys, or the Northern Italy, sailing down the Rhine, and the Netherlands. Oh, the Hague, how charming. Well, citizens, I will take leave at present and welcome your return, and rest you assured, I ever remain your humble and obedient servant, as I know does Ms. Elizabeth Lucas. We look forward to seeing you again. Godspeed.